every time we come up with something to make our lives easier, we don't acknowledge that we're squishing other things down further in the stack and not necessarily understanding them, which is what we have to do to understand modern systems. So I don't know that we need to be emotionally invested in modern systems, but I think we do need to acknowledge that the complexity has its own requirements.
Hi, I'm Liz Fong-Jones.
And I'm Charity Meters.
And you're listening to o11ycast, or o11ycast for short, a fortnightly series about the art and science of making production systems observable, easy to maintain, and appropriately reliable.
o11ycast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest in this show, or if you have a specific topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us on Twitter at o11ycast.
Before anybody starts to do a feature flag, I need them to understand what their software does in the first place.
Oh, that's a tall order.
I know, but I feel like we would build better software if we knew how it was going to end up. Just a crazy thought I had.
So it's kind of similar, I guess, to this idea from chaos engineering that if you don't understand what the question is that you're asking, if you don't understand your hypothesis, then you can't possibly run an experiment.
Yeah, I think it has been easy for developers to follow orders, and just following orders is always the worst plan.
I agree. That is the ideal. But how many of your users actually meet that bar before they get started?
I don't know that the individual developers do, but we find that when people are incorporating feature flags, they've gotten far enough down the path that they're like, wow, I wish that some part of this didn't work all the time, or did work part of the time. And once they've gotten that far, then they can have a conversation about, you don't need to know why this is wrapped in a feature flag. You just need to know that somebody cares.
And it sounded like you were saying that people come to you because they've run into a wall. Like they know that they want to deploy their code, but not to everyone at once. They want to have more control over it, or they've been burned. Like they've accidentally blasted it to everyone. And I can see this. Like this is a pain that pretty much everyone who's ever deployed software has had at one point, right?
Yeah, I think that everybody has pushed to production when they shouldn't.
What?
I do.
I have a friend who works at Squarespace who said that she had her heart rate go up twice as fast because someone said to her in Slack, oops, did I run that against production by mistake? The answer was no, as it turned out. But
so I'm teaching my kids to drive right now, and I'm thinking a lot about how this is one of those analogies that's just going to haunt my conference talks forever. The way you teach people things is not to give them this academic setting. Like they took driver's ed on Zoom.
You create a craving in them.
Yeah, like to teach a man to build a ship, you must instill a yearning for the sea. But also, it doesn't matter how much Zoom driver's ed you had, you have to get behind the wheel. Mm-hmm. But you don't have to get behind the wheel on the freeway. You can get behind the wheel at midnight in a dark suburb in a parking lot.
Mm-hmm. Controlled circumstances.
Right. And then as you gain confidence, you're going to move to bigger environments. You're going to move to more complexity. It's going to give you more capacity to do things. Like you can't go buy milk if all you can do is drive in a parking lot.
Yeah.
You can buy milk if you can drive back roads, but you can't really go interstate if you can't do freeway speeds. So you're just going to keep ramping up.
Well, I grew up in Idaho where there were 1,300 people but I take your point. In civilization, yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, I like this. And I feel like this is kind of, we talk a lot about the bad old days when ops was stay out of production, this is my area, and devs are but we want to play, and people ask me surprisingly often, what do you mean by guardrails? What does it mean to build guardrails for your developers so that they're, I think of production kind of like a playground, right? And it's a playground. You don't want your kid to die going down the slide.
Right. We've taken all the metal stuff out. Mostly you're not going to rip anything open.
Yeah, they can get dinged up, but the swing set is not literally 30 feet off the ground. You don't want it to be that easy for people to die. There's risk, right? But making it sized appropriately, feature flags is the first thing that I always jump to because it decreases the scope. It gives you control over the scope. Who do you want to see this? When? and you can just flip it without even having to go through the whole deploy process.
Right. And I think that's a really interesting thing. Like, you've been talking a ton about how important it is to be able to deploy in living memory of when you wrote the thing and then see the results. And that feedback loop is something that we've been, I don't want to say idolatry in CI/CD, but kind of.
It's one of those like the what do they call those cornerstone species or whatever, like the foundation of an ecosystem. Like if you can get that right, so many things are set up to go right by default without you having to think or try really hard. And if you get that wrong, so many things are set up to go very poorly.
Right. So to circle things back around to the question that we originally asked, it sounds like feature flags and the ability to deploy small changes safely, that actually is the you must be this tall to ride for many other things.
Yes.
So there's really not that much of a you must be this tall to ride for feature flags, but it in turn enables you to do so many more things.
By the way, this seems like a good time for you to introduce yourself.
My name is Heidi Waterhouse. I'm the principal developer advocate at LaunchDarkly. I've been there 3 years. I just hit my anniversary.
Wow.
And I have spent that entire time going around the world telling people that they could be less scared if they just use this tool. And I feel like we're finally getting somewhere where we can combine that with chaos, we can combine that with observability and say, what if development and deployment were not the scariest thing you did with your day?
Yeah. And it's like there's this craving on the parts of many people to hear that all they need to do is buy one tool. Buy a tool, do a thing, and a lot of vendors play into this too, because they'll be like, well, my tool is the bestie tool, you buy my tool. Always bullshit, right? But there's this whole ecosystem. And it's kind of like once you dip your toe into one corner of the pool, you start to see why you need other pieces, other parts of it, right? Like they enhance each other, they play together nicely, they amplify each other, and they give you superpowers.
And I think the interesting thing is, like, we just did a survey, and LaunchDarkly has about 200 employees and about 240 applications in our Okta, which made me want to lie on the floor and die, honestly. I'm like, I can't handle this. But not everybody sees every application. Like, I don't need Salesforce. I don't need Zendesk. Those are not my problem. So those can be partitioned off from me. But I think all of these things that we are doing tools for are not new. Like, feature flags are not new. It's just that people had been...
It just knows that they've been done over and over, and people have done these shitty reimplementations of them, right?
But it turns out that we have finally hit a cost tipping point for tools that makes it affordable to not roll your own. That you can buy this, and it's better to spend your time on other stuff.
Well, some of the stuff that you guys have done has been, like, you've done some really interesting novel stuff on the front end. And correct me if I'm wrong, I could be completely out of date here, but my understanding of your business model was that you're basically selling to, like, marketing teams and, like, not developers as much as, like, the less technical people to be able to flip things on and off.
So it depends, much like the myth about the elephant and, which part of it you grab. It depends who you ask. If you ask our front-end sales team what is exciting, they're like, what if product managers could do this without having to bug dev to turn something on for them? If you ask the dev team, what they say is, what if product managers could do this without bugging us? And what if I had the power to do my own testing? What if I could see my stuff in production without going through this entire approval process? If you ask me, I think that, like, the long-term payout, now that we've added workflows, is workflow management, is almost middleware.
Say more about that.
So, and this is like heterodox even in the company, just to be clear. But I think what we are actually providing is an ability for people to execute business logic without knowing code. And I don't want to say codeless. There's a lot of code.
Sure.
But the people writing the code don't always have their finger on the pulse of what the user needs.
And, like, writing code is hard. It takes a lot of cognitive and emotional energy. And, like, just as a principle I live my life by is try to do the laziest thing that you can, right? It's democratizing. It makes it so that it's, if it's not like this, you have to be the priest in our cult in order to like flip these flags, right? It means that it's more participatory. It means that, I've often said that like, tools build silos. The border of your tool is where the silo edge sits, right? If you don't share the same view of reality, if you don't share the same interface, if you don't share the same tool set, then you're living in different worlds. And what I love about, I think that software engineers, I think that we're getting a little less snobby about this stuff. When is it, there are no like new VIMs that are being written, right? Like we're like, actually, we are human beings. We are prone to human biases as just like all the other human creatures around us, right? And it turns out when you make tools that work well for non-engineers, they're really great for engineers too.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, it's a super interesting thing, right? Like we see our sales engineers and our account executives turning on and off flags for customers, right? And it's amazing to see them just, reach in and do it. And it's just like, you know what? Okay, they don't have to know how to write a single line of code to do this. This is super exciting.
So many people have been, raised with this idea of coding is like, it is literally magic. Like if you're not a quote unquote coder, you're not in the club, you don't understand. It must be so far outside your comprehension.
There's always this weird paradigm with like, not just the code, but then the config for the code, right? Like, there used to be software engineers who were deathly afraid of touching YAML files, right? And for good reason.
I know so many people who don't write a single line of code, like our marketing person, Deirdre, and yet can talk about it so much more intelligently and intelligibly. Like she understands what she's saying. She can come up with great new insights. She doesn't need to be able to write code to understand technology. And there are plenty of people out there who do write code who can't do that. Like I feel like these skill sets they're not overlapping the way we treat them at all. Understanding and doing are not the same thing.
Yeah. And like, I'm a non-coding DevRel, which is sort of a weird place to be.
I've always been intrigued by that. Can we detour a little and talk about your journey?
Sure. I spent 20 years doing technical writing for a succession of companies. About 18 months in, I had learned everything I was interested in and about the company, fixed their documentation, and I would ride off into the sunset. I eventually made a business doing that, where I'm just like, okay, startups, you have fucked up and you have not done documentation. And now you're like 2 years down the line and it needs to happen and you don't know where to start. So I'm going to come in, fix it all for you and leave it so that you can hire somebody less expensive to maintain it. That means that I knew the product and the theory.
Yeah, you can't fake it.
And you can't fake it. So like I worked on Microsoft BitLocker. It was like one of the projects that was really revolutionary for how I thought about these things. And I knew everything from, I sat in meetings where we had an argument about the switch that had to flip. Like it was actually a physical hardware flag at boot time to enable the TPM chip to, basically report that it was feeling okay.
You didn't understand a word of what you were talking about, I can tell.
Yeah, exactly. All the way up to I'm watching end user tests of Windows 2008 and seeing how tragically that whole security check was going to fail.
Why didn't you decide? Because it's the easy answer is to go, well, this is the path that is people look up to. It has the prestige and the money. Like, what? Why didn't you?
I find it boring. I find the problems in socio-human technical systems much more interesting than I find figuring out where the hell I put that semicolon. And could I learn it? Probably. Will I learn it someday? Maybe. I was looking at maybe I'll do some glitch apps because I have some things I want to express.
Tech for me has always been about solving a problem. Like I cannot motivate myself to do something unless I believe it is the most important problem, the number one, the thing that is blocking us, right? I can motivate myself to do literally anything. If it's that, if it's anything else, I can't do it.
Yeah, I struggle with that because I'm like, okay, but I could solve this problem for the long term, or the thing you're asking me about is a short-term fix and I don't want to do it because it's dumb.
Yeah. I struggle with it because I feel like I would love to be someone who does computers for fun. I would love to have hobby apps. I would love to be someone who can just sit there and learn a language and fuck around. And I've tried, and I just don't know how to get my brain to fire on those cylinders. Mm-hmm. It feels to me like it's a purer form of motivation than, well, rage. Honestly, I run on rage. Let's be honest. I feel like I burn it as a fairly clean fuel, but it's still rage. It feels like, being motivated by the joy of the technology. I would enjoy that feeling if I could feel it.
It's so interesting because one of the conferences that I'm a huge fan of, I'm not sure, have you been to this conference before, Heidi? It's called Bang Bang Con. It's about the joy and surprise of computing.
I've attended it, and I find it charming. I've never gotten a talk in, but someday.
You said it was the joy of programming, Liz?
The surprise and joy of programming.
Ooh, I like that.
All of my conference talks also run on rage. Like every single one, the secret beginning of the talk is, I'm really pissed off about.
This is why we're friends.
The talk that I'm currently gestating is about Lillian Galbraith, who was an early motion studies expert. Like she's the reason we understand the kitchen triangle. And I want to talk about developer ergonomics.
Oh, the mom from Cheaper by the Dozen.
The mom from Cheaper by the Dozen.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Loved those books. I read the biography of her by one of her kids, too.
Yep. But let's talk about developer ergonomics from a really feminist point of view to say work is not value in itself. Work is value because it accomplishes something. Mm-hmm. Like there's no merit in walking across your kitchen 20 times or in using an IDE that doesn't work for you.
There's so many people who don't get that. So many.
Okay, devil's advocate, though. I feel like, is what we do, is it labor or is it creative output? Is it labor that we do because, you get where there's a spectrum there,
yeah.
And a lot of what makes us love our jobs and everything is, yes, it's labor, but it's also, there's this creative aspect to it that is, you can't do as good of a job if you don't love it. And I feel like there's a contradiction there where I have just learned to love the hate. I've often thought systems are getting so complex, so complicated, so hard, so intricate that you can't really just show up and clock in and clock out and do something by rote. I feel like you have to be pretty emotionally invested in it to keep up and to master modern systems, which was not really true of the LAMP stack. There was a lot you could just run this, run that, automate a little bit. And I feel like it is becoming more of an art form.
So a couple years ago, I watched a talk by DHH called Read Me. And this talk blew my doors off because he talked about conceptual compression. He also talked about Piketty and being divorced from the product of your labor and how it causes ethical decline. It was great.
Nice.
But he talked about conceptual compression, that every time we come up with something to make our lives easier, we don't acknowledge that we're squishing other things down further in the stack and not necessarily understanding them, which is what we have to do to understand modern systems. So I don't know that we need to be emotionally invested in modern systems, but I think we do need to acknowledge that the complexity has its own requirements. And it's either a really solid foundation or the willingness to burrow through it. I have this interesting point of view, partially because, I live in Minnesota, and unlike when I come to San Francisco, people go to their day jobs as programmers for Target and Medtronic. Mm-hmm. And then they go home and talk about other things.
Exactly. San Francisco, the Bay Area is still where most innovation is happening. There's this hotbed of people who are really passionate about what they're doing. And people come here when they crave that, and they seem to leave when they're done with it.
Maybe. I don't know.
I'm not sure that's true. I think it's where the funding is.
It's not universally true, but it is largely true. And it is somewhat self-reinforcing.
I think there's good PR. I think there's probably...
So I've spent the last 3 years traveling the world, giving talks over and over and over and over. And I used to think it was a myth. And I no longer do.
Yeah. I also have this problem where I'm it's really easy to be self-reinforcing in the DevOpsy, dev tools, startup landia. There are far more developers working for Target than any of our 10, favorite companies.
So let's talk about the DORA metrics, like 2018, 2019. And I'm so depressed that like there's going to be no more DORA reports. It's just
killed by Google.
Oh my God.
Gosh, darn it.
But like you notice that like 2018 to 2019, like the bottom 50% are like losing ground.
Yep.
And the top 20% are like starting to reach like escape velocity. And I don't have like their caliber of data yet, but it seems to be that the tool set, the self-reinforcing tool set, if you get started with feature flags and you want observability and you might, if you're standing still in computers, you're losing ground.
Absolutely.
Where are you? There are some systems that aren't growing, right? That just need kind of care and feeding.
They're absolutely speaking in generalities that are not 100% true. But I think by and large, every system I've ever worked on, you're losing ground if you're not trying to stay ahead.
Yes. I can certainly see that. And I certainly see like the DevOps transformation of large, old companies is fascinating to watch. And I just finished reading Project to Product, which was great. And it was like, why do these things keep failing? Why can't you get a DevOps transformation to work in a, billion-dollar enterprise?
Yeah, because it has nothing to do with being a better engineer or a worse engineer. Like it has nothing to do with that whatsoever. What do you think it has to do with?
Value stream mapping. And now I sound like one of the like analyst wankers. But
sorry, what was that?
Value stream mapping.
Value stream mapping? I've never heard of this.
What are you doing that makes value for the customer? What are people paying you to do? And how do you trace that back through all the layers of your company?
And the gentleman who kind of introduced us to the software world, his name is Simon Wardley.
Was this Wardley?
Yes.
Yeah.
And he kind of introduces this idea of, right, like trying to figure out what is generic heavy lifting, right? And what is your unique value, right? And trying to disentangle, right? Like, which pieces in that stack, in that chain are where, right? And it's not necessarily true the higher up or the lower down it is, the more, heavy lifting or unique value it is. It really, really depends. So that's kind of the really cool thing that I love about value stream mapping too, is that like it lets you kind of crystallize and visualize all of this stuff.
Interesting.
It's super interesting. And it's a new way to think about it because it says not what are we making, but like what value do other people derive from what we're making?
And Charity, you may have actually seen this when we put together the observability maturity model, right? Like we used a value map for that rather than.
I remember what you did, and I also remember not fully getting it. Like it was not clear to me that the process was what led to the result, I guess. But I need to like understand this much more. That was the first time I'd encountered it, and it clearly didn't really click with me.
I think like you have to run into it a few times. And Charity, your history has absolutely proven your point about if you're not running, you're falling behind. I think that a lot of the DORA report indicates that if you are not transforming, you're going to get eaten by people who are. That's not exactly the same thing. You could be delivering good value without transforming.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're fine until you get disrupted.
Yeah.
Like, for example, like the New Jersey unemployment system was working fine until there was a catastrophic load on it. And then everything broke because nobody tested that.
So I think maybe that refutes my earlier hypothesis that there are some systems that don't need to kind of advance in that,
Well, they don't until they do.
Yeah, they don't until they do. Okay, yep, I'll concede. I was wrong earlier. You've changed my mind.
But yeah, it's super interesting to me, though, like how long can you go?
I mean, the New York Times is still running on COBOL, and that'll work until it doesn't, right? Their subscription stuff is all... I was at the New York Times like a year or two ago, and they were like, everything that makes us money is still on the oldest parts of the system from the 70s. I may be misquoting them, but it was just like, yeah, stuff that was like built in the 70s, still working. They've got specialized parts, couple people who know how to make it work, but it's so hard. And
the other one that we know for sure is true is Ticketmaster. Ticketmaster still runs on a VAX.
Yep. And we get requests all the time for a COBOL SDK. Like, if you know any brilliant COBOL developers, send them our way because we need a COBOL SDK. Because we want to sell to insurance companies. They're very risk averse.
Of course.
But I think that it's really interesting. Was it Corey Quinn who said legacy software, or as I like to call it, revenue generating software?
Sounds like a Corey.
I keep thinking about that. Like, legacy software is what makes us money. And we disrespect that.
I don't think it's that we disrespect that. It's that I hope that the lesson that we've learned is we can't allow things to become that legacy. We have to continually upgrade them. There comes a point where it is approaching impossibility. And like the bigger the gap gets, and the more people who knew how to run it die or leave, that the harder it becomes, and you're just asymptotically approaching impossible. And I hope that the lesson that we have learned is not, don't have valuable things. It's if it's valuable, that means you have to change it often, constantly, keep it warm.
Yeah, like Charity, I love the saying that you have that, like, shipping is our lifeblood.
That's the intercom,
right? Like, yeah. And I think a lot about, how like sharks, right? Like sharks, if they stop swimming, they stop getting oxygen, they die, right? Like you got to keep moving.
It's like what you were saying, Heidi, the last thing we were doing together, where you're like, if you want to move safely with purpose, move fast. The slower you go, the less safe you will be, which is counterintuitive to us because we come, pre-built with all of these like notions about physics. But it is absolutely true.
Right. We just need to elevate our physics understanding to like ice skating. Like, good luck standing still and not falling over. Like, standing still is the hardest thing.
It really is.
So to touch briefly on another subject, how do we actually convince people to change their code? How do we actually convince people to not just, say, be spectators in the sport of observability or feature flagging, but instead to actually embrace modifying their code to empower themselves?
I think the first thing that I always do is ask people what they're scared of. We are mammals, and we spend a lot of time being scared.
Fear-driven development.
Yes. And so when I say, hey, let's do this radical thing where you wrap all of your features in this code and anybody can turn it off at any time. And they're like, yikes! I'm like, okay, so lean into that yikes and tell me what you're scared of. And here's some suggestions on how we're going to make that actually feel safer than what you have now. So when we say, okay, we're going to instrument everything and return enormous amounts of data, people are like, I don't even know how I'd process that. Like, that is so much more data than I have right now. I will be overwhelmed by it and not be able to find the signal in the noise. So then you can show them, okay, here is a change that you've made. Here is the effect that it had. Here's how you can see it.
So I guess that's kind of exposing to people that the things that they're most afraid of are already happening in production, that there are safer ways to do things, right?
Everybody thinks that just because their alarms aren't going off, it means that like nothing's breaking. Ask anyone from ops. There are so many things broken in your production system at all times that you just don't know about yet. Silence should make you afraid.
Yes, it's like parenting. Like, why has it gone so quiet?
Everybody leans so hard on the fear response. Like, everybody who's selling software in our space, at least, is like, you're going down. All this downtime stuff. And like, honestly, I feel like I get that closes deals, but I feel like the adrenaline receptors in our brains are just kind of overactivated all the time these days. And the real reason why people should want this software is a very different feeling. It's the feeling of glee and joy and triumph and conquering and success and efficiency. Like the neurons that fire in your brain when you're solving a puzzle or you're doing a video game and you find the thing that you weren't expecting to, you solved the quest. Like, that's what I associate with this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's harder to market that.
Sadly, the reason we're doing it is money.
Right.
It is really hard to explain to your CFO.
It does sound more optional when you put it that way.
Yeah.
But it'll make my life more like a video game.
Yes. It will make your developers happier is not something we've actually... We've done like token, would you like some sparkling water? But we haven't done like, would you like a 4-day work week? And one of these costs real money and one of them doesn't.
It's so unfortunate that engineering managers aren't given like one budget for their people and their tools, because I am still amazed that we're running Honeycomb with as few people as we are. And we're only able to do that because we dog food so heavily, because we can move, because we can see what we're doing, because we rarely make missteps, because we rarely have shit that we have to back out and redo. And it makes me so sad that most people have never had this experience. And they think we're just like blowing vendor smoke up their ass. All right, now we're just like into the, but what if users would just do what we told them to all the time? Wouldn't that be great?
Well, right, but it's so frustrating that we have to have people repeatedly run into the same walls that we've run into for the past 10 or 20 years. And then they have to get those bumps in their heads before they're like, okay, wait, I'm willing to try another way, right?
It is so satisfying, though, hearing our users come out and say things like, oh my God, I just adopted Honeycomb and SLOs and deleted 90% of my paging alerts, and we get woken up less, and our users are happier. Like, it's really satisfying being able to amplify some of those voices now.
Absolutely. And I think that that's important for people who get woken up to hear.
Yes, there is hope.
Yeah, and I think that they will eventually become the people who are making the build versus buy decisions. I think that, we're working through a generation in like a lot of social issues. We're working through a bunch of people who are sort of stuck on, it sucked for me, it should suck for you too. Instead of, it sucked for me, how can I make it better for you?
Gosh, I hope you're right. It's been so nice having you here, Heidi.
Thank you.
You're just a ray of sunshine. Liz, anything else you wanted to cover?
No, this was a fantastic conversation. I enjoyed it very much.
All right, I got a couple things.
Yeah.
We just announced a Honeycomb integration with LaunchDarkly.
Right.
And we're super excited. And we'd like to encourage people to visit the LaunchDarkly site and see how you can use Honeycomb to see what you're doing with feature flags and get that super instant feedback dopamine hit.
They complement each other beautifully because, what's one of Honeycomb's things? High cardinality. What is a high cardinality dimension? Well, it might be the monotonically infinitely increasing build ID. Being able to break down by build ID, being able to break down by feature flag and just go, oh, if I flip this flag on, what about all the variables? What happens to them? It's really kind of miraculous.
Yeah, running those multivariate experiments can be so costly and annoying and frustrating, right? But having BubbleUp expose which feature flag values are most associated with a slowdown or a speed up, right? Like, that's magic.
It is magic, and it makes it safer for everybody. So, like, if you see something happen in Honeycomb and you can turn it off right away, then you're, like, empowered.
And also, right, like markers, right? Like the fact we've supported markers for deployments for ages and ages and ages, right? But knowing when the feature flag flipped and having that indicated visually on your timeline, magical.
So fine-grained. People are so used to quote-unquote debugging, but it's like they're trying to build this intricate castle in their head about what's happening. When you can like stop doing all of that work in your head and just look at it in the tool, oh my God, it's such a cognitive relief.
Yeah. So that's the thing that I'm really excited about right now. I'm like, yay, we're getting a whole bunch of integrations out and they're going to make all of these tools so much more powerful. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how the workflow thing helps people move their value along through their silos, like basically greasing the pipe with feature flags.
Yeah, for sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on, Heidi.
Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you.
That was a delightful conversation that I enjoyed, and I hope you did too. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you have a specific topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us on Twitter at o11ycast.
To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, check out their library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders. Hope to see you next time.